The first thing you would notice, if you stood in the dim antechamber of the royal palace in Jerusalem in the 12th century, was not the gold nor the banners, but the way knights lowered their gazes. They did not want to meet the king's eyes. There was a hush that fell over the room, not from fear of his power, but from something far more intimate, a discomfort at the sight of a young monarch whose body told a private, humiliating story. Skin pallid and scarred, lips stained and cracked, a hand that trembled and occasionally curled uselessly at his side. In the next 40 minutes, you are going to learn the astonishing medical and political truth behind Baldwin IV, the Leper King, and why his life, his bravery, and his choices changed the fate of the Crusader Kingdom forever. We will pull apart the old chronicles, read between the lines of William of Tyre, compare them with modern medical insight, and reveal 3 revelations about Baldwin that most history books gloss over. But first, the scene that sets everything in motion. Picture this: July 1174. The bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre ring for a king who is scarcely a man by age. Baldwin, barely a teenager, mounts the throne not because he's the strongest warrior, but because destiny and a cruel disease forced him into the role. He had already been marked by a sickness that in medieval minds was both a physical ailment and a moral sentence. Leprosy, called in the sources morbosis, or the White Plague, is not merely a cosmetic condition. Even today, modern dermatologists and historians studying the descriptions in contemporary letters agree that Baldwin's illness progressively deadened nerve endings in his extremities, created grotesque ulcers, and altered his face. Imagine being crowned at 13, while the organs of your body are quietly being betrayed by bacteria that eat at nerves and flesh. His own mother, Agnes of Courtenay, politically powerful, despised by some, protective of her son, negotiated the coronation in a court that already whispered. People remember Baldwin's crown. Few remember the price of that coronation. The disease was first noticed in childhood. Medieval physicians were called to bulging joints and strange white patches on the skin. They did not know about Mycobacterium leprae, but they recognized the pattern. Loss of sensation in fingers, numbness that turned a prince's sword hand into a liability, sores that would not heal. For a king who was expected to ride into battle, to grip a horse's reins in dust and thunder, this was a nightmare. Yet Baldwin did something no one expected. He refused to pretend he was not a warrior. He took the saddle. He took the field. He learned to fight with what remained, to turn the weaknesses of his body into tactical advantages. Here's the first shocking revelation. The image of Baldwin as a weak, bedridden figure is a distortion. Contemporary chroniclers, enemies and allies alike, repeatedly record a pattern that cannot be explained by mere political myth. In November 1177, outside the plains near Ramla at Montchaussard, Baldwin rode out with a pitifully small force. Some records say only a few hundred knights. Saladin's forces are described as numbering in the thousands. Many in Jerusalem expected a disaster. Some historians later dismissed Baldwin's charge as temple legend. But when you line up the facts, the medical descriptions, and the tactical choices, a different picture emerges. Baldwin was not leading from a balcony. He was leading from the front. He positioned his men to exploit a lapse in Saladin's lines, banked on the shock of a determined heavy cavalry charge, and personally threw his weight, literally and psychologically. into the fray. Witnesses wrote of a young king in full armor, his mantle flapping, urging his men forward. The Templars and Hospitallers, hardened and fanatical, followed him. The result was a rout. Saladin's army, surprised and disordered, was driven back. Jerusalem had survived a massacre by the merest thread, Baldwin's audacity. So how did a leper lead such a fight? Modern clinicians point to the unpredictable course of leprosy. The disease progresses at different speeds in different people. Baldwin's nerves may have been failing, but his core strength and endurance remained intact for years. His loss of fine sensation might have dulled his grip, but it did not erase his balance, horsemanship, or combat instinct. He learned to compensate. There are also moral reasons. A sovereign with a visible affliction had to prove his legitimacy constantly. Each charge he led was a demonstration that despite the disease, the anointed king still embodied the martial virtues expected of a ruler in Outremer. But Baldwin's struggle was not only physical, it was political theater turned bloody reality. The Crusader Kingdom was a fragile mosaic of feudal lords, wealthy Italian merchants, militant orders, and semi-independent principalities like Antioch and Tripoli. Baldwin's advisors, the wise Raymond III of Tripoli, the bold Balian of Ibelin, the patriarch Heraclius, formed a fragile web of regency and counsel. Behind the scenes, men like Reynold of Chatelain were making decisions that would eventually force Baldwin into the impossible position of choosing between political unity and military necessity. Here's the second revelation. Baldwin's famous insistence on exercising royal authority, often described as stubbornness, was a survival strategy. He knew that the Crusader states were only strong if their nobility could act in concert. When nobles squandered resources on private raids or harassed Muslim caravans, they gave Saladin the moral and strategic high ground. Baldwin's interventions, sometimes brusque, sometimes cruel, were attempts to impose cohesion on a fracturing polity. At times, the personal and political collided with tragic intensity. Baldwin's sister Sibylla, beautiful, politically ambitious, and alternately adored and feared by the court, became a focal point. Her marriages and heirs would later shape the kingdom's fate. Baldwin worked hard to secure a succession that would keep the kingdom intact, even as his own body betrayed him. He made choices that look Byzantine now. He crowned his young nephew Baldwin IV as co-king in 1183 to secure continuity. And he tried to control marriages and alliances that might wreck his work. He backed the principled Raymond at times, and at others put his trust in pragmatic schemers. These were not just petty power plays. Every marriage, every betrothal, decided who would be trusted with the defense of a land already hemmed in by hostile neighbors. The medical reality of Baldwin's body deteriorated slowly, then suddenly. Chroniclers remark on his steady decline. Hands that could no longer hold a sword, feet that were numb, ulcers that fuzzed and scabbed then opened again. William of Tyre, writing decades later, is sympathetic but candid. The king's flesh betrayed him, but so did his contemporaries' squeamishness. Medieval leprosy carried a social death before the actual one. Patients were often isolated, their touch feared, their food approached with caution. Baldwin, however, refused to become the sort of monarch who retreated. He instituted a court system that adapted to his needs. Messengers carried his commands. knights tightened their reliance on verbal orders and standards. He developed a close inner circle who would lift him from saddle or litter, arrange his armor, and cover for the physical tasks he could no longer perform. You can almost see him in these scenes. A king whose crown is heavy not only with gold, but with the awareness of an entire realm looking to him for courage and cunning. But the disease also reshaped Baldwin's psychological landscape in ways historians often underplay. There are hints in the sources of a man who, confronting daily deterioration, became unusually sharp in judgment about the core threats facing his kingdom. Illness compressed his time horizon. Where a healthier monarch might indulge in long-term dynastic games, Baldwin became unusually focused on immediate security and tactical advantage. His orders were brisk. His punishments for treachery could be emphatic. This focus risks being misread as cruelty. But viewed another way, it is the deliberate resource allocation of a leader who knows his window of command is closing. The key military theater of Baldwin's reign was his struggle with Saladin, the Ayyubid Sultan whose name still carries weight in both histories and imaginations. Saladin was not merely an enemy, he was Baldwin's mirror. Both men were charismatic, pious, and skilled at command. Both understood how symbolic victories and defeats could ripple across the Levant and Europe. The encounters between them were not just battles over territory. They were acts of narrative power. Each contested town, each surprise raid was a paragraph in a broader story of legitimacy for the caliphates and for Christendom. Baldwin's victories, Montchesard chief among them, were blunt, dangerous, and brilliant. They bought the kingdom time. Yet time was precisely what Baldwin did not have. By the early 1180s, his mobility declined. The ulcers deepened. Sensory loss in his hands meant he could not reliably manage weapons or the reins. Doctors of the day tried topical poultices, fumigations, and bizarre regimens rooted in humoral theory. They bandaged, cauterized, and prayed. Modern scholars surmise that repeated bacterial infection, combined with the malnutrition of campaigning and the stress of constant conflict, accelerated systemic decline. A king who in 1177 could ride and lead was by 1182 a monarch who rode only in carefully staged moments, his public appearances choreographed like a theater. Curtains, hired pages, and the rituals of coronation masked a body that was gradually becoming unusable. This is the third revelation. Baldwin's public image was deliberately managed to preserve morale and to deter enemies. When chroniclers describe the king as cheerful or bold, they are partly describing a political performance. Baldwin understood that his visible vitality was a weapon. Thus he cultivated visuals and moments, appearing in sovereign regalia at the Holy Sepulchre, presiding over judicial councils, granting lands that signaled continuity. He staged military tour of the frontier, not always to fight, but to reassure allies, to inspect defenses, and crucially, to signal that Jerusalem remained an active polity. These actions palpably strengthened the fragile alliances he needed. Yet inward rot and outward bravery reached a tragic confluence in Baldwin's last years. The campaign seasons of the early 1180s were brutal. Saladin grew bolder, consolidating Muslim power across Syria and Egypt. Baldwin's inner circle fractured under stress. Rivalries over who would hold regency and who would secure the next marriage for Sibylla became existential fights about the kingdom's survival. Baldwin attempted to wrest control of the succession to prevent a disastrous choice. He crowned his nephew Baldwin V and attempted to name Raymond as regent. He did this not out of sentiment, but because he believed, rightly, that a weak or incompetent successor would hand Saladin the chance he needed. On the personal level, Baldwin's illness assumed grotesque symptoms that medieval observers could not divorce from their spiritual worldview. Leprosy was associated with sin in popular imagination, but many chroniclers insisted on Baldwin's sanctity. He fasted, attended Mass frequently, and performed acts of charity. This religious devotion seems partly sincere and partly political. A king in the grip of a visible disease needed moral authority to counter the stigma. Pilgrims wrote of seeing him humbly at the altar, of hearing him bless the sick. Yet the same sources also record the humiliations. Insensitive courtiers who turned away, the careful footsteps of those who washed the king's feet, the quiet shame when bandages needed changing. The court adapted rituals to preserve dignity. Private audiences, sealed letters, strategic public-facing ceremonies. Baldwin's medical decline included alarming systemic signs. Chroniclers report that he occasionally suffered fevers, bouts of vomiting, loss of weight, and the progressive deformation of his hands and feet. Modern medical historians reading these fragments point to the likely cascade. Repeated secondary infections, neuropathy leading to traumatic injuries that did not heal, and malnutrition resulting from years of campaigning and stress. It is important to understand, Baldwin was not dying of vanity or purely of physical pain. He was presiding over a kingdom whose strategic landscape was changing rapidly against him. Each hospital visit was both a medical consultation and a political crisis. There are small, heart-rending vignettes that humanize the Leper King, and that I want to share because they have a way of cutting through the grand narrative. One chronicler recounts Baldwin, unable to hold a cup, laughing at his own awkwardness, and asking a squire to feed him like a small child. Another recalls him, after a long council meeting, retiring to a quiet chamber where he wept for the kingdom and for his lost childhood. He had been crowned while still a boy. There are tales, too, of personal bravery. Baldwin reportedly once stripped his armor in public to bandage a wounded foot himself, refusing to be treated as untouchable trash, to show his people that he remained one of them in suffering. These scenes are the human hinge between the strategic and the medical. They explain why his contemporaries, despite the stigma, often idolized him. The final act of Baldwin's life is both politically decisive and medically grim. By 1184, his condition had worsened irreversibly. He could no longer ride to battle. His voice grew thin, yet he remained mentally acute. In private, he orchestrated legal measures and dynastic safeguards. The decision to crown Baldwin V as co-king was, in many ways, Baldwin IV's attempt to bequeath his will beyond death. But the court's grudges, the ambitions of men like Guy, of Lusignan, Sibylla's husband, and the petty feuds between aristocratic houses made Baldwin's wish only partly effective. The kingdom had not been mended, it had been bandaged. When Baldwin finally died in 1185, the event was mourned as both a personal and political tragedy. Medieval obituaries speak of tears, of the bells tolling, of Jerusalem's streets draped in black. Yet even death did not end the practical concerns his life had occupied. The succession that followed devolved into bitter contest, and the fragile unity Baldwin had preserved cracked. Within 2 years of his passing, the kingdom faced calamity at Hattin. A catastrophic defeat in 1187 that culminated in the fall of Jerusalem itself to Saladin. Many historians draw a direct line from the succession crisis Baldwin could not fully resolve to the disaster that followed. This is not to place blame wholly on him. The forces arrayed against the Crusader states were immense and numerous. But Baldwin's death did remove a leader whose presence, despite failing health, had been a crucial adhesive. What did contemporaries, friend and foe, think of Baldwin? Remarkably, his reputation crossed cultural lines. Muslim chroniclers, when they mentioned him, often did so with respect tinged with awe. Saladin, who was a chivalric and pious rival, recognized Baldwin's courage and statesmanship. Later Western chroniclers elevated him into a near-saintly figure, a warrior prince who bore suffering with dignity. Modern historians have unearthed a more complex portrait. A man constrained by disease, constrained by fractious nobility, but who used what authority he had with decisive cunning. Some revisionist scholars argue that his insistence on unity directly prolonged the kingdom's existence by decades. Others contend that his inability to force lasting reforms of the feudal system limited his legacy. Both perspectives have merit. The truth is that Baldwin's mix of martial courage and political acumen created a temporary balance in a world where balance was everything. There are a few lesser-known facts that add nuance to Baldwin's story. For instance, he fostered close personal ties with military orders that were often portrayed in later histories as self-interested knights. Baldwin valued the Templars and Hospitallers not just as fighters, but as administrative and logistical partners. Their fortresses, agricultural estates, and networks of influence were central to the kingdom's resilience. He also sponsored defensive architecture, towers, fortresses, and sallying points that delayed Saladin's consolidation. These investments were not glamorous, but they were vital. Another detail: Baldwin's personal piety was matched by a willingness to negotiate with Muslim neighbors, from prisoner exchanges to truces, when it served Jerusalem's survival. He was not a headlong crusader in the simplistic sense. He was a realist. And yet the visceral nature of his disease produced unavoidable indignities that medieval biographers recorded without euphemism. While you will not find modern medical reports to view, the descriptions in the chronicles of open ulcers, swollen limbs, and the slow wasting away of a warrior's body are grisly. We are tempted to reduce Baldwin to a tragic medical case study. That would be a mistake. He was always more than his veins and sores. He was a symbol of defiance, of the intersection of divine right and mortal frailty, of a kingdom clinging to an impossible shore. Before we go on, quick favor. If any of this has surprised you, if you never pictured a leper as the architect of bold military surprises and delicate political maneuvers, hit that like button so others can discover this buried story. I've still got 2 more startling revelations about Baldwin's death and the way his reputation was reshaped after his passing that will change how you view the end of the Crusader Kingdom. But first, a detour into one final human scene. Imagine Baldwin near the end, a stooped figure in a dim private chapel, the incense smoke curling around his head. He is weak, yet he signs decrees, his hand shaking on the parchment, each stroke a tiny sacrifice. He meets with his sister Sibylla in private and tries to sway her toward choices that would secure the king's will. He writes letters to commanders on distant fortresses, suggesting reinforcements and rationing. He spends nights awake listening to the city's distant bells. There are accounts of him receiving pilgrims, blessing the poor, and weeping for the land he loved, not only because he was losing power, but because the land itself, with its interlocking neighbors and families, was slipping toward a precipice. Now for the next revelation. Baldwin's death was not only a medical event, it was curated. The succession that followed and the versions of Baldwin's reign that circulated afterward were shaped by factions. The supporters of Guy of Lusignan produced images of Baldwin's later decisions as misguided. Supporters of Raymond cast him as a protector whose plans were betrayed by selfish courtiers. Chroniclers, always partisan, emphasized the aspects that validated their lords. What this means is that the Baldwin we encounter in medieval books is both real and constructed. To reconstruct the man, scholars must sift through partisan praise and bitter invective to arrive at a balanced portrait. The result is a picture of a complex, contradictory king. Charismatic yet constrained, brave yet failing, shrewd yet not omnipotent. What about Baldwin's actual death? There are no lurid, gory stories of a corpse exploding in a coffin. The medieval record doesn't show that kind of physical spectacle. But there are testimonials of a piteous decline, fevered nights, convulsions, long periods of silence, and finally, a quiet exit in 1185. The body was buried with the rites appropriate to a Christian king in Jerusalem, and yet the funerary ceremonies themselves became another battleground of memory. Political rivals argued over the language of hagiography. Clerics and nobles alike sought to appropriate Baldwin's image for their own ends. That is why, in part, his legend has both a saintly glow and a martial shadow. Finally, Baldwin's historical legacy is paradoxical. He is venerated as a symbol of courage and tragedy. For many later medieval writers, he represented the ideal of the warrior king who took suffering and turned it into authority. For modern analysts, he is a case study in how illness intersects with political leadership. His life suggests that physical fragility does not necessarily equal political impotence. More practically, Baldwin bought the kingdom crucial years of stability. He forestalled Saladin's ambitions enough to allow European reinforcements to arrive intermittently, and to force Muslim leaders to fight for legitimacy rather than merely for land. Those years mattered. And yet his death, and the succession crisis it triggered, show how fragile any achievement can be when institutional cohesion is lacking. Leaders can try to engineer continuity with coronations and carefully chosen regencies, but without a robust administrative foundation and a culture of shared sacrifice among elites, even the most heroic king's plans can unravel. So where does that leave Baldwin in the sweep of history? He is both hero and cautionary figure. He demonstrates how personal suffering can sharpen political focus, how charisma can temporarily glue a fractious polity together, and how, in the end, structural weakness can undo even the most valiant leadership. He remains an enduring figure precisely because he embodies both hope and failure. a king whose body bore a visible stain, yet whose will for a time resisted the tide that would sweep away his world. If this account of Baldwin IV, his youth, the slow horror of his disease, his daring at Montchaussard, his delicate juggling of nobles and knights, and his haunted final acts moved you, there's more. Next time, I'll dive into how the memory of Baldwin was reworked by later rulers to justify the political choices that followed. And I'll expose the surprising cross-cultural admiration his enemies wrote about in Arabic chronicles. Hit subscribe so you don't miss that investigation into how legends are built and how a single sick king could shape the fate of an entire region. Click the bell and join me for the next chapter where we trace the last echoes of the Leper King through the ruins of fortresses and into the chronicler's pens. See you in the next story.